Good morning,
Good morning.
Dr. Whembolua and Dr. Griffith.
Morning.
I'll introduce myself and pass it over to you, Dr. Whembolua, and then we'll have our guest, Dr. Griffith, introduce himself. My name is Donaldson Conserve. I'm an associate professor at the George Washington University in the Department of Prevention and Community Health. And I'm also the founder for the Black Male Professors and Research Collective Initiative. And I have the pleasure today to have for our interview in the Black Male Professors series, Dr. Derek Griffith, who will be co-interviewed with my colleague, Dr. Whembolua. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is, and first of all, good morning to all the individuals who are, and good afternoon for anyone who is going to be watching this recording. My name is Dr. Whembolua, and I'm an associate professor in African Studies at the University of Cincinnati. I'm also the director of the Global Health Studies there, as well as the director of the interim director for the Social Justice program here. And it's also a pleasure to be here with all of you for all those individuals. And I'm also a member, obviously, of the Black Male Professor Research Collective. And as part of this initiative, I was really thrilled when the name of Dr. Griffith was mentioned. And today I would like to first welcome Dr. Griffith, as well as making sure that we understand what we're going to do. We're going to try to really go to the journey that has landed him where he is today, and understand what are the different factors, as well as the inspirations, and whether they are like in public conscious, whether they are in the public discourse, or family members who have inspired him to have the career that he has today. So first of all, welcome, Dr. Griffith, and as well, I would like also to give you the time to introduce yourself.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both for inviting me and for being here, and I look forward to the discussion. As you said, Derek Griffith, I'm a professor of health management and policy at Georgetown. There I also have an appointment as a professor of oncology, founded and co-direct the Racial Justice Institute. That's a university-wide entity, as well as founded and direct the Center for Men's Health Equity within there.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Griffith, I also would like to, share with anyone who's watching. You are also a mentor for both of us, and particularly, I could not help to think about, even when I was preparing for this position at George Washington University, you were very instrumental in helping me with that process. So I would like to start by sharing, my gratitude for your mentorship over the past several years before we actually dive into some of the questions. And the first question we have for you is if you could take us back to the little boy that, where were you born? How were you raised? What's your background? Before we get into all the academic stuff.
Yeah, well, let me first say thank you to you. I mean, to both of you. It's always a pleasure for me and an honor to just continue to pass on the knowledge, experience, make use of the gray that I have, so that others don't have to prematurely gray. So it's always a pleasure to be able to share that with others, and for you all to be able to take the torch and continue to blaze the path forward. So thank you both for all that you do.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I was born in Washington, D.C. at what was then called Freedman's Hospital. It's now Howard University Hospital on Howard University's campus. My dad was at the time a medical student at Howard University, where he graduated a few years later. He graduated actually a couple months after I was born. My parents are from Guyana and from Jamaica. And so I am, I guess you consider second generation, as they both immigrated here in their earlier years. And so that combination, has very much shaped sort of who I am, and even just some of the nuances of what I study. Before we get to that, so I grew up primarily in the Atlanta area. We moved around a little bit before that, but grew up primarily in Atlanta, still consider that home. Parents and sister are still there. Have moved around quite a bit since then. For undergrad at Maryland, University of Maryland, College Park, so back in this general area where I am now. That degree was actually in psychology and African-American studies, double major. Then grad school at DePaul University in Chicago. My training is actually in clinical and community psychology. So to finish my degree, I had to do a clinical internship. And I did that at Yale University at the Consultation Center at Yale in the Department of Psychiatry. There's a division of psychology within there. So it was one of the few in the nation that was a combination clinical psychology as well as community psych. Community psychology is more of akin to sort of the department where you are, Donaldson, in terms of community health. It looks at prevention science, evaluation, has in the past looked at things like what was then called empowerment theory, which is, we can talk about its own challenge, but nonetheless, is about, how do you actually work yourself out of a job in this public health space, if you will, by equipping the community to be able to do for themselves and be able to transfer our knowledge and our expertise into those spaces. Finished at DePaul, did a postdoc at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in community-based participatory research. It was a Kellogg-funded postdoc. Then took a research faculty position at University of Michigan to work with one of the leaders in community psychology, Mark Zimmerman, in the Prevention Research Center. Did that for about 4 years. A tenure track position opened up as I was finishing the third year of that particular position at Michigan, also in the same Department of Health, Behavior, and Health Education. And so competed for that at the same time I was getting, finally got a career award from the American Cancer Society, which was sort of, their version is called a Mentor Research Scholar Grant versus an NIHK, but it's the same, essentially 5 years, 70 or so % coverage of your salary and so forth. And spent 4 more years on tenure track there. Then went to Vanderbilt for almost 10 years, and now at Georgetown for the last almost 2.
And let me, and first of all, congratulate you on that journey. But as we are, and we expect to have a very diverse, audience. And you have mentioned a lot of keywords: career awards, tenure track, professorship, postdocs. Well, maybe, and not everyone may be familiar with all of them. But let's start. Maybe let's fast forward a little bit in the sense of, or at least sign up on a specific period. You mentioned children of individuals who worked at least in the medical field, at least on your dad's side, and you live also in Atlanta. First year as a freshman, what was your dream job? This is a question that I tend to ask to all the students that I meet. And I was wondering if on the first day, if I had met you at University of Maryland, what would you have said would have been your dream job at that point?
I would have said I had no idea. I was actually admitted to University of Maryland. My official thing on my admissions letter was as an undecided major. Okay. And throughout my undergraduate years, literally the running joke when I would go home is, "What's your major now?" Because I was, pre-law at some point. I never wanted to be pre-med because my dad was like, "Medicine is too hard. You don't want to do this." My mom actually had a public health degree. I didn't even know really what she did. And she worked in public health, worked at CDC for a bulk of her career. Didn't really genuinely understand what she did. And then, sort of stumbled into this space after that. But yeah, it wasn't until my junior year. So I was pursuing psychology, even though I had no clue what I was actually going to do. I was pursuing psychology with the good adolescent brain of, okay, well, people seem to like to tell me their problems, so I should get paid for this. And so I might as well get paid for it if people are going to randomly come tell me all their problems and confide in me and so forth. And so I said, okay, well, I'll do psychology. What I struggled with at that time was that there was not a lot of representation of Black people, people of African descent, diverse folks, period, in those spaces, non-white people in those spaces, and certainly not in the literature. And so I struggled to figure out, well, how do I actually fit into this space? I took a class but I also sort of liked African-American studies. I just sort of found it interesting. I had no desire to be a professor whatsoever. Even as I finished and went into a non-tenure track position, I still was very happy to not be a professor, because I didn't want the responsibility of teaching and service and doing all that kind of stuff. We'll see what happens with that. But at the time of undergrad, I took a class called Race, Class, and Consciousness in my junior year. And it was taught by a professor who was on sabbatical from the University of Pittsburgh named Jerome Taylor. And his course was basically life-changing for me. And he really did set me on a path to do the work that I've done. Because the course was, basically he showed me a bunch of social science research, and particularly psychology research, that was dealing with the issues of race. That was dealing with issues of race and racism and so forth, stereotypes. He actually pioneered a scale in, I think it was 1971, on internalized racism. And so it was interesting to look at that, and so my senior thesis actually was on the implications of that for self-esteem and other factors, and how that related to students' experiences and so forth. So that was really the early part of that path, was really just trying to understand who I was. But it was a lot of moving around. It was a lot of uncertainty. I, took a while, and I still, you have to imagine I have a career in something that my degree is not in.
Okay.
I don't have a degree in public health. I did a postdoc in public health, which did not grant a degree. I have no official public health degree. I didn't officially ever take a course in qualitative research. A lot of my work has been qualitative. I've sort of had to teach myself that. So a lot of things have just been, out of necessity and out of need, out of opportunity and necessity, that I've sort of evolved into doing the things that I felt like I needed to do.
Like, second question, and already I can tell that we're not going to have enough time. So on the first day, you stated that you didn't know exactly where you wanted to hand. You still you still chose two majors, psychology and African studies, or African American studies as it was known at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The last day of school at the University of Maryland, when you received your degree, did you know where you wanted to go?
No. So I knew I probably wanted to go on to grad school, because I didn't think my job prospects were that great with a degree in psychology, not knowing that I couldn't be a psychologist until you had a PhD. And the African American Studies was a combination, honestly, of I liked all the courses, I did well in it, and I was already pretty close, so I might as well finish out the major. And I just saw it as something that really fed me as a person, that I was just interested in, but I didn't see it as something that was going to be fundamental to a career. So the year as I finished, I worked at the American Psychological Association. I started doing that work later in my junior year of college, and so worked there throughout my senior year, and then that was my first job. And that was sort of buying me time to figure out what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go to grad school, and just to give me a breather between undergrad and grad school. I knew I wanted to go to grad school in psychology, frankly, really to buy me more time to figure out what I really wanted to do. So my approach to a lot of things has been, okay, I don't necessarily know what I want this to yield, but I know what skills I'm trying to develop. I know I want to have options to choose something that I want to do, but I am often finding myself in the place I can't figure out exactly what it is I want or what it is I'm really trying to go for, but I want to have myself have the broadest range of options. So when things present themselves, I have the choices I can choose among things, as opposed to being stuck with choices that I don't necessarily want.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this part of your journey so far. And you mentioned buying time to decide to go to graduate school. And I'm curious if you could share when you were thinking about well, how long, first of all, it took you to, how much time did you end up buying to make that decision? And how did you decide about what graduate program to apply for to become, make sure you're competitive? And was it a master's or did you go straight for a PhD? And how did you make that decision?
Yeah, so some of that was easier. That I knew I wanted to stay in psychology. Again, I didn't have a clue, despite my mother, as embarrassing as this sounds, but despite my mother having an MPH from Columbia, actually, and have had started her career in that, father in medicine and so forth. I didn't really pay attention to what they do. They were just my parents, and I was like, okay, she does this stuff in the community and all this education, whatever. So I'm sorry, repeat your question for me.
Oh, yes,
I go down this road again.
How much time did you decide?
It was only a year. Yeah.
Okay. And then what program did you decide? Was it a master's, a PhD, and how did you prepare?
Sorry, thank you. So, yeah. So I spent a year. I was only out of school about a year. For psychology, it's a little easier because you can't be admitted to straight into a master's program. You have to be admitted to a doctoral program. The ones that I went into at the time, you couldn't really get a master. Psychology doesn't really have a terminal master's degree. You have to get a PhD. The only reason people have, at least in the past, a master's degree or MA in psychology was either because they didn't finish it or because it was not really meant to be a terminal degree. It meant to give you certain skills, but it wasn't meant to be. A terminal degree is one that gives you entry into a field, like a master's of public health. You can be a public health professional with a master's of public health degree. You can be a social worker with a bachelor's or master's in social work. You can't be a psychologist and call yourself a psychologist and do all the things that as a professional you can do without having a PhD. So because I wanted to be a psychologist and that was kind of what I knew, I was only looking at psychology doctoral programs because I still had this thing of, okay, I need to find something tangible that I need to do that can pay my bills, keep me out of my parents' house, and so forth. So I'll do the clinical psych thing. So I really only looked at clinical psychology programs. The one I chose was DePaul University. And it was because it actually was similar to what I ended up doing. It was unique in that it was the combination of clinical community psychology. And so there was always this part of me, the community psych side of it allowed me to continue to study the things that I sort of sparked in me through the African-American Studies major and program. And I'm old enough that actually my degree actually says Afro-American Studies. So this tells you how far back we're going. So we've gone from Afro-American, African-American to Africana Studies and, so forth. So, but anyway, the point is that my mentor there, I went there because of the potential to work with my mentor, Roderick Watts, who was there and was doing work on racism in organizations. He had eventually developed this concept of socio-political development, which is kind of how do you help people understand more critically their social and political world? How do you help people understand what they can do around them? And so that was intriguing to me as a complement to the foundational skill of, okay, I can talk to people and, make money to by doing therapy, doing, psychology testing and so forth, psychological testing and so forth.
Thank you. Now, the next question I have is related to your experience in graduate school, right? So you take a year off, you apply, and thankfully you get accepted. How was, if you can, remember, how was that first semester for you as a PhD student, a Black male PhD student at DePaul University, and over the years as a PhD student, success, challenges, support and guidance you receive, and to help you finish, because we know it's not easy to get into a PhD program and stay and finish.
Very true. Yeah. So the first should also say that I got into only, I think, maybe 2 or 3 of the probably 10, I don't remember how many programs I applied to, but I should explicitly note that it wasn't like I was some stellar undergraduate student and was like well sought after. I got into a numerical minority of the programs that I applied to. It just so happened that I was able to pick the one that fit me best, even out of the ones that I applied to that I didn't get into. It was frankly a lot of anxiety day one and throughout the program, because it was still the problem of I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Again, I knew I wanted to pursue this degree. I was trying to make sense of it. It still didn't feel like the pieces were coming together for me. So, the good part of the early part of a doctoral program is it tends to be relatively structured, at least in psychology, well, in public health too. The first couple of years, you tend to have the same basic courses. So you're just sort of going through and doing that kind of stuff until you get to more of the elective courses and so forth. So it was just kind of going through that. It was challenging. Actually, I'm trying to make this short. It took me 8 years to finish my degree. In other contexts, probably would have been at risk of not finishing. I actually didn't think I was going to finish. I got, part of the challenge with psychology programs. So I went to a school, DePaul, that was not a research intensive institution at the time. It was very much more of a teaching institution. I had no concept of this, certainly, going into school. What that meant in this context is you didn't have a wealth of opportunities to build a dissertation or build research off of that was going to help you jump that next hurdle to move on to the next step. So, and for our program, you had to do a master's thesis and a dissertation. So I had to do a full study for a master's thesis and defend it, and then do a full other study for a dissertation. And that took, I think the first one took 4 years because it was hard to figure that out. And that was really on the development of, it was looking at, my master's thesis looked at what were the strategies that African-American undergraduates at a couple of different institutions thought would be effective in creating social change. So Black students at predominantly white institutions, what did they think would actually, be effective, and sort of mapped it onto a framework that looked at, traditional sort of social change movements and so forth. I got through, all the required parts and so forth. Again, you had to go away for a clinical internship. So I moved to New Haven to do that. Had a dissertation idea because during my doctoral degree, I think I had only a partial scholarship. So I worked pretty much the whole time I was in graduate school, doing either psychological testing, evaluation, evaluating community-based programs and so forth. And so I had a lot of side jobs while I was in graduate school to pay my bills and so forth. And so, what I ended up doing, again, had to move to New Haven to do this pre-doc internship. I had a dissertation idea that was out of one of my jobs, and I think I'd written literally 90-something pages of a proposal, and my committee came to me and basically said, you can't do this anymore. Like, you're going to have to start over. And this is halfway through my internship year, which meant that the only thing left for me to do was to finish my dissertation. And I'm thinking I'm, halfway done with the proposal, I hadn't defended the proposal, but I, completed what I thought was pretty close to be able to defend the proposal. Had a very, again, robust draft of it. And they were like, oh, the people who were doing the study that you were building this off of changed the measures. What they did is essentially they decided that the measure that they were using that I was trying to build my dissertation from was too long. So they basically said, okay, well, which are the the items, they basically selected some items, but it's some statistical process of doing it. So they didn't pick an explicit subscale, they just picked the items that they thought had the highest loading on that particular factor. And so that's what they had. And they were like, that we can't have you defend this because we can't defend the choice that they made. So you have to start over. So I literally was halfway through it and was like, I don't know what to do. So I literally started looking at other jobs, had to go get another job that actually took me back to Chicago, and was able to build a dissertation off of some work my mentor, Dr. Watts, had done a sabbatical where he was very interested in social activism and young social activists. So he had done a sabbatical where he went to, I think, 6 or so predominantly Black cities and interviewed young social activists. Young at this time, he considered was under the age of 35. And so they were involved in on the ground community organizing, activism, and so forth. And so my dissertation built off of that, and I interviewed them to look at actually something similar to what we're doing here, which is what were the critical points or the critical periods or critical decision points at which they made a choice that led them to become activists versus people who have the same level of knowledge, the same level of insight, but don't actually get out and do things. And so that ended up being my dissertation. But to do that, I ended up going back to Chicago to work on a project called the City Project, which is Community Intervention Trial for Youth, I think is what CITY stood for. It was an HIV prevention intervention it was actually the largest at the time CDC had funded for 15 to 25-year-old young Black men who had sex with men. And it was about the outcome that they were interested in was unprotected anal intercourse. And so this was my first real entry into public health in terms of physical health. Psychology is very much more into mental health and so forth. But this was sort of my toe in the water with public health, not really thinking of it as a career and a job. It just happened to be something that I was doing because it fit my skill set in terms of, the planning, the community organizing and so forth, and the community psychology side of what I was doing. But that was kind of how I ended up. So I worked there full time. I worked 40 hours. So I did what we're now exploring. I worked essentially 4 10-hour days, and then Fridays were my dissertation day. And so that was essentially how I finished my dissertation, but it took into 8 years to finish that.
And a question for individuals, thanks for sharing that part of your journey. But a question that a lot of people who might not be in academic, or actually even people who are in academic may ask is, how was that financial life during those times? In the sense that a lot of individuals have the impressions that, whether they're wrong or not, that in order to pursue higher education, you must either have a lot of money or time to spend, in a sense, as opposed to say, hey, I get a job, get paid now, get the reward of having at least a bachelor's degree that most people have in this country, as opposed to pursuing higher education. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, since you took so long, and yes, there are different circumstances, how did you view finance at that time? How did you mentioned a little bit how you support that time, and how do you view it now with the hindsight of the fact that you are where you are today?
It's a great question. And I'll connect it to one of my favorite books when I mentor people, and I don't think I probably have mentioned it to you, is is called The Startup of You. And it's written by the founders of LinkedIn. And the connection is basically what they say is, you create a plan Z. Plan Z is basically this idea of what are you going to do so that you can stay solvent, that you can take care of your basic substance needs. You have a roof over your head, you have food, you have basic sort of things. So what is that basic thing that you have that frees you up to then pursue what you actually really want to do? So for me, that was kind of, I knew I didn't want to go back home. I knew I didn't want to go back. Like, it wasn't an option. They had changed it. My parents, God bless them, had decided that my room was going to be, I think that it became my mom's sewing room or something. She was just like, she immediately converted it to something else. So it was like, yeah, you ain't coming back home. So both of us sort of knew I wasn't coming back home. So I had to figure it out. But I always, again, my plan Z, before I even knew this was a term, was I had to have skills that I could then be able to at least pay my bills, or at least try to help pay my bills. They did support me, partially with different things if I got into a bind and so forth. But that was where doing these sort of jobs and so forth, that actually ended up being the reason that I got the pre-doc internship at Yale versus probably other people, because I ended up having so much experience doing those kinds of jobs, having that, being able to say, yeah, I actually did help to evaluate this program and that program, and, had been part of this, had my first publication with my mentor because I worked on the project that ended up being the conceptual foundation for the publication. So yeah, I think having that, being able to roll with that, those challenges, and still figure out how are you going to do what you want to do? How do you still, move forward in that space, has always been something that I've had to figure out how to do.
So you talked about, the fact that it took you 8 years, the fact that you also contribute by having a job on the side, and at least a job that was actually connected to what your dissertation. It was not like totally distant.
Well, it was connected to my field. It didn't necessarily have anything to do with my dissertation. So like one of my main jobs, again, was doing psychological testing. So my dissertation ended up being about, development of activists, and they were sort of connected, and there was always a stream of work that was always connected to social activism, Black people in social activism, social change, and those kinds of things. But the ones that paid the bills were really just, leaning on my more basic sort of training in psychological testing, evaluation, clinical care, clinical work, those kinds of things that I learned in the program, but that were not really my passion. The passion was the other stuff. But again, doing the testing and doing those kind of things that I enjoyed, but it wasn't really where my heart was, allowed me to free me up so I could do the stuff that I wanted to do.
And you mentioned that that the book starting of you by the LinkedIn founders, this is a book that actually was instrumental, as well as one class in undergrad. So those are critical time, right, where you actually seem to have been touched and feel like, this gives you that brings you closer to your purpose. My question is now, the day you receive the fantastic day where you receive your PhD and say, well, now I'm Dr. Griffith. Did you have now a sense that the puzzle is coming together, that you know exactly where you would like to do, what would you like to do? And if not, how did that happen? What was now the process?
So now I had realized I didn't want to do what my degree was in, which was I didn't want to be a clinical psychologist. I didn't want to just talk to people. It was fine. I found, it to be fruitful and so forth. But, and as important as I understood and recognized that it was, I knew that that rate of change and that level of change of one person at a time, making small change, was important, critical work, but just not the work that I felt like was really my calling of what I really wanted to spend most of my time doing. So then I was like, okay, well, I saw literally a flyer for the Kellogg Community Health Scholars postdoc. And it was so this time I was working at the University of Illinois Chicago, even though I was going to DePaul. They're obviously both in Chicago. Yes.
Can you elaborate for people who don't know, what is a postdoc? Is that a job?
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. So I threw out a lot of things. So undergraduate was basically a bachelor's degree, following high school. A pre-doc, so when I went into the doctoral program to get a PhD, in between there, I got a master's degree in psychology. To finish the PhD, I had to do what was called a pre-doctoral internship, which is basically that you have to be able to show that you have the clinical skills to be able to do clinical research, to be able to do clinical practice. So while the degree, a PhD, grants you, is really about research skills, to get a degree in a practice area like clinical psychology, you have to also show that you have the skills in being able to do the practice side of your job. So a pre-doc internship was basically showing that I had the skills to be able to do clinical psychology related things like individual counseling, family counseling, individual testing, those kinds of things. A postdoc is, once you finish your PhD, is a way to get additional training you're finished with your degree. So you think, well, why do you need more training if you just got a PhD? It's because there often are things that are more specialized, or some people often use it to move into a different space and career. So for me, it was my opportunity, once I'd finished my PhD and didn't have any experience in public health, that I took a position as a postdoc to basically move me into, or at least stick my foot deeper in the water to see if I wanted to do this public health thing as I figured out what the heck it was. And I chose the postdoc that I chose because that particular postdoc was called the Community Health Scholars Program. It was very much based on, and it was about community-based participatory research. Well, the principles of community-based participatory research are akin to what I did in community psychology. And so there were a lot of similarities. The CBPR, community-based participatory research, is a long-winded way of saying that you're going to work in partnership, in equal partnership with people in the community who are not academics, who are not necessarily professionals, but yet have expertise in their lived experience in the communities where they are, that we need to, that complements and that is equally important to, and in many cases more important than the degree granting knowledge and education and so forth stuff in books that we've gotten. But if you want to understand how you're going to change people's lives and community, you got to understand the community context where they are. CBPR basically says we have to balance those two, and it teaches you how to work with community in that space. And so it was a more explicit sort of training in that particular approach to doing research, which was not about the methods of, study design and those kind of things. It was really, how do you look at the work that you're doing, the purpose of it, and the way that you're going to go about it to achieve something greater than what you would normally do just by yourself. And so that was when I entered into the space of cancer. That was when I started to do more explicitly, took the stuff I'd done on social change and social political development, and that led into work on anti-racism, dismantling racism within organizations and so forth. So how do you understand what racism is from just less of an abstract sort of conceptual thing to how does it operate in a public health department? How does it operate in a community? And how does that help explain things that you can't otherwise understand without understanding how race is playing a part, and what are the things that race is a proxy for in those spaces that are adversely affecting people's health and well-being. And so that was how I started into that space of both men's health, because I'd done stuff, the work on social political development was on young Black men, was with young Black men in high school and Chicago schools. So we would go into those schools and utilize, again, this is dating, it's the MTV generation. So we would use movie clips, music videos, and so forth as the tool to help them and teach them a process for how do you break these things down and look at the relevance of that. What are they saying to you and what are they not saying to you in these videos, in the story that's behind the videos, in the clips of the movie and so forth. And how does that help you better understand why your neighborhood looks different than, say, downtown Chicago? Why are there more potholes in your in the area like Cabrini Green, which is, for those of you not from Chicago, it's near Chicago. It's where, again, it dates me even further. The show Good Times would have been set, if you ever heard of Good Times, but it was the housing projects, public housing, that area was, Cabrini Green was the housing project where they would have lived in. And so the point is that, of course, neighborhood, that environment looks very different than, say, the high rises of the Sears Tower and stuff in downtown Chicago. So why does your neighborhood look very different? Why are the resources very different there than downtown? And so social political development is how do you help people sort of to take things that are in their natural environment and break down and look at them more critically through that eye, And so that stream and that theme of doing that very much aligned with anti-racism and very much aligned with this whole new level of how do we look at this in terms of public health? Public health for me was just a more concrete way to say, I found it useful because it was a more tangible outcome on which to explore the things I wanted to know about racism and so forth. And a frankly harder outcome, who lives and who dies is about as cut and dried of an outcome as you can possibly get. And so that was how I ended up in public health, was sort of going through that process. But my early jobs and so forth were all linked to this idea of, how do I work with community? How do I understand that context? How do I help to identify, build the capacity of the community, partner with them to do things that were going to advance the work that we were trying to do together?
Thanks.
Thank you. I couldn't help but to think about the journey that you have shared and how it was, of course, not linear, but you didn't give up. You stayed the course. You changed, from clinical psychology. Well, I wouldn't say change, but you finished the degree, found out that this is not what you want to do. You find a postdoc. You again continuing to acquire more skills to have more opportunities in the future whenever they would emerge. I could not help but to think, one of the reasons we have this Black Male Professors Researchers Collective initiative is to share the exciting part of doing research, of going for a PhD, and sticking to the journey and going into academia and succeeding and so forth. But I can't help but to think about maybe someone who's maybe eventually watching this, and like, when did it click for you? Like, when did you start to have some excitement about being a researcher, being a PhD student, through all that struggle of 8 years, changing course, going for a postdoc, staying in, like, what kept you going? What was your fire, your why, beyond, just trying to survive and have the skills, but like, yeah, if you don't mind.
I'll try to answer that. I mean, so amid all one of the blessings and the curse of whatever I've been called to deal with in life has been that even in the darkest and most challenging times, there's usually been a nugget of something positive, or there's usually something that happens that sort of balances those things out. And whether it's the greatest time, something bad often sometimes happens, or there's something contextually that is challenging, or when something bad happens, there's something positive that also is coming out of that. So throughout the whole, I would even say from undergrad, when I found this, African-American studies, race class consciousness, this racism thing that I didn't know other than was a bad word to people, like, and this is, again, early 90s, so we're talking about. So I graduated high school in 89, college in 93, took the year off, finished my PhD, master's in 98, PhD 2002. So just contextually, if you sort of put that in that sort of time frame, this is way before, racism is a public health issue, way before you could say racism in a professional journal and space and so forth. But from the time that I found this thing in, like, at that time, again, African American Studies and so forth, that started the fire. Like, oh wow, this is fascinating, this is interesting, this is exciting, this is giving me something, this is feeding me in a way that I hadn't seen before. This nugget of throughout graduate school of this stuff on activism, social political development, like then getting into, because I had the background in African American Studies, that led me to look at things very differently than most other people. So I would go back to historical documents, like the paper that I was mentioning, that was my first paper with my mentor and a colleague in 1999. Actually, one of my most highly cited papers. It's called Social Political Development as an Antidote to Oppression. But it starts with a quote from something in 1902 that I found when I did an independent study, because I had this background in Afro-American studies. And so I would always try to figure out, well, how do you make sense of these things? And so even some of the stuff in that paper that's about spirituality as one of the key things that we have to lean on if you're going to really understand activism, social change, and so forth. You have to look at spirituality has always been a key part of that, not necessarily organized religion, but how people understood a bigger purpose for themselves. But finding those things and being able to connect those dots, that was the thing that sort of throughout that, there was always something that I was learning that was different, or some new opportunity that I was like, okay, I don't know where this is taking me, but I know that there's something here that I just need to kind of continue to, this is the kind of stuff I want to continue to explore. And this is the kind of stuff I want to continue to figure out. And I don't know how to do that necessarily. Many times, most of the time, I still find myself like, okay, there's something I want to do right now that I'm just like, I don't know really how to do this, but I just kind of have to, okay, since I don't know what to do going forward, let me immerse myself in what I'm trying to do now. Let me prepare myself by doing the best with, finding out making sure I understand what I know, what I don't, publish what I have that's in my queue, get those things out, clear my space and clear my deck so that when that opportunity finally does come, that I'm actually in a position to take it. So there's always been something that was sort of the thread that carried me through, even when it wasn't certain what those things were. But yeah, I can't make it sound like there was anything, magical, linear, like you're saying. It just.
I understand. Sometimes you have to put in the work even when you don't know where it will take you. And that's what most of, I think, life is about. It's not knowing what will happen the next day, but doing the best that you can with the day that you have and with the resources you have been giving. And because we don't have all day, I want to fast forward a bit to what made you decide to now enter into academia as opposed to going into working in another setting? What attracted you about that option? And then what has helped you to, remain in academia for?
And also another fact, if you could also share what are some of you believe some of, because I believe that you are still in academia, if you share with the public some of the the benefits that you feel that you have as a member of academia overall.
Okay. So one of the things I'll tell you is I'm bad at answering multi-part questions. You probably figured this out now. So you're gonna have to walk me through the different pieces of this, but I'll do what I can. So the why academia, I think was the first question. Yes. Okay. So it really ultimately, the short answer is because it provided me the space to do what I wanted to do. When with all the challenges, all the other hoops and things that you have to jump through in academia, you still have the intellectual freedom, the professional freedom, even if people don't like what you do at your institution or don't understand what you do. And many times they don't understand what I do, but they see me still getting published in places. They still see me, getting funding to do different things. They don't completely get it and they can't explain it necessarily all the time or can't do a full job of explaining it. But nonetheless, they can't take anything away from the success. And so the reason I started out with a career where I wanted to do work in communities, and I couldn't figure out how to, frankly, get paid enough to be able to pay back the loans and other things. While I worked, there wasn't enough. So I still took out federal loans and so forth to pay for grad school and so forth, that I ended up, finally, when I finished, one of the first things I applied for was the NIMC loan repayment program. And so that helped to pay off the work. So what that is the National Institutes of Health has a program that started, thankfully for me, around the time that I was finishing, that if you did work in the broadly health disparity space, if you looked at differences in either how do you understand groups that are not doing well in terms of their health and well-being, and how do you improve their health, or how do you understand differences between two groups when there should not be a difference. There's no biological or health or biomedical reason that those two groups should have differences in health outcomes. And so if you're trying to explain those things, particularly as it relates to race, ethnicity, and other factors that they've identified as markers of difference that they see as important to better understand. So if you're doing work in that area, then they will repay portions of your loans to do that, to continue in that work. So I needed a job that would basically allow me to continue to do that. And I took a job that basically allowed me to, I ran in the Prevention Research Center at Michigan, a program called Community Capacity Building to Address Health Disparities, or something like that, which was, again, working with community partners to help them be more effective, impactful partners in a collaboration with the academic institution, with the health system, so the hospital system, and the local public health department. And how do we understand, how are they going to get their needs met in the context of that partnership? And so that was the job that I had. And so I couldn't figure out what other context was going to pay me, frankly, to continue to do that on the ground work. And so that was kind of why I decided I wanted to go that route. What I realized is, as much as I didn't want to be a professor, or didn't care, or was ambivalent about being a professor, it provided me the financial support and the freedom to study things that I thought were important, that other people, at the time did not study, or did not really explore. So, this is, again, first paper was on social political development, and actually had oppression in the title. We're talking about racism, talked about intersectionality before it was even a term. So it was 99 that was published. So we wrote it in like 97. The first paper I wrote that was on racism, dismantling racism, was 2007. And so this is well before, the point is, this is like well before this became sort of a popular sort of thing to talk about what is this racism thing, and how does it relate to public health, health science, and what do you actually do about it? And so wanting to continue to do that work, I had to figure out where can I continue to do that? Because that was what I found interesting and exciting. But continuing to do that, I also realized in the role that I was in, that I didn't have, whoever paid my bills basically dictated what I could do. And so the challenge of being a non-tenure track person was I was beholden to my mentors, or the person who had the grant from the Center grant, and that, if he decided on a good day that I could do whatever, and that I was free to do whatever, but I had to do his work first before I got to do the stuff I wanted to do. And I was like, I had to come up with, actually I went to another mentor, collaborator of mine, and he basically helped me come up with a plan to work my way out of that role, where it was 100% of that soft money. He bought out some of my time. This is Harold Neighbors, Woody Neighbors, helped me buy out some of my time to work in the Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health at Michigan, to then help me transition, to buy me time to basically write a career board career board is basically a grant that is both, it's to prepare you, again, you're hearing that, having a bachelor's degree, having a master's degree, having a doctoral degree, having done training after the doctoral degree was still not enough to get me to where I wanted to go. So there's always more and more training that I needed. So, and part of it was because I was transitioning from a field, so I didn't have these fundamental skills in public health. So I had something that was adjacent to it, but I didn't have those kind of core skills. So the transition into tenure track was because, again, I knew that it provided me the freedom to, as long as I could get it funded, as long as I could get it published, that they didn't care what it was, what as long as the funding came from key sources and covered a certain amount of money and so forth, that's all they cared about. And so as long as I could do that, then that was all that was important.
And I just want to highlight two side notes for individuals who are joining this conversation. You mentioned the word tenure and non-tenure. Non-tenure is a position where you can work in a university and you have a contract for a specific time. And that means that you are on contract, that you can be, and you work at, at the disposal of the university, meaning that it's possible for the university to either end that contract or to extend that contract, meaning that your life might be a little bit more unstable than if you are what people refer to as a tenure track, which is really the golden goal for most academics, which is you work at the university for doing a contract which varies between 6 or 7 years or 8 years, and the university at the end of that period state will give you what people refer to as tenure, and tenure would translate in most institutions, in at least in the US, as a job for life, meaning that you have a job, except if you do something criminal or something that may be obnoxious, that may be exceptionally wrong. You have the ability, you most likely will have a job for life. And you also mentioned the fact that you also built a different grant, which is a career award. And you explained that partially, meaning that it's a grant that allows you to do several items or to work and to receive a payment and a salary for X amount of years of months, because you have established a plan of the things that you're going to do in your research.
That are training. So it's, and the last part with the career award is it's covering to train you to have that more specialized skill to do that particular study, and then also pay some preliminary money for the study itself. So at the end of that time, you are prepared to lead the study, and you have the preliminary information that you need to propose the study and have a better chance at it actually getting funded.
And in the interest of time, I do not know what Dr. Donaldson will say, but I believe that we have reached almost the end of these discussions, and we may need a second discussion with you to ask several points. But still, I would like to thank you for the different aspects that you mentioned. The fact, first of all, that you were not sure about exactly what you wanted, and you still were not sure, despite the fact that you were pursuing a higher degree, higher degrees everywhere. And also the concept of having those key moments, whether it was a course, whether it was an individual's, who helped you, guide you through, but you were still adding what some people will refer to as key or tools that you want to add. And this is something that I want to share with all the audience, that a lot of us tend to see degrees not only as a step to a job, but as a key, something that can open several doors, and those doors might be totally different, whether you want to do academia, or whether you want to go into the industry, or whether you want to do something totally different. And we have seen here the example with Dr. Griffith, who has collected all of those degrees and those different trainings, and then find out exactly what he wanted to do. And I believe that at this stage of his life right now, knows exactly what he'd like to do. And at least at some point in professionally, that's at least what says your CV.
Yes.
And be able to now navigate and reap the benefits of having a job, which is academia, where you don't have someone who's actually reviewing your case on a daily basis, and you have the freedom to do the research on the topic that you want. So I'm going to pass the mic to Donaldson to see if Dr. Donaldson, if he has something to add or something that you would like us to conclude this great discussion.
Thank you very much for the summary that you provided of what Dr. Griffith has shared. I could not help but to think one last question could be, where are you now? I know you introduced yourself and you shared your position, but where are you now in that journey? How do you feel about where you are now in your journey? And what do you do on a weekly, daily basis?
Yeah, so in some ways, I'm still trying to figure that out. In other ways, the part I have figured out is that I'm now in a place where I can do things, say things that I've always wanted to say, or that I knew were things that needed to be done, but now I'm in the position that I was hoping somebody else would be in. So just as a concrete example, I recently, with the men's health work, recently became the chair of a group called Global Action on Men's Health. And, the idea that men die, 6 to 7 years, younger than women, pretty much in every culture, in every country around the world, with a handful of exceptions, is not something that tends to be a public health issue that people actually see as worthy of investment in time. I've been blessed to be in a position now that I can not only lead that work in the United States, but also galvanize partners globally to do that work. So we have been, working with the Pan American Health Organization to build their capacity and to partner with them on how to do that. We have Global Action. The majority, I think, of members are from so if we look at the regions of the World Health Organization, they divide the globe into 6 regions. The region of Africa, of the African region, with the majority of our members come from that region of the world. And so the idea that we can partner with, collaborate with folks in Africa, again, my parents are from the Caribbean, being able to do more of that work. Like, I'm finally in a position where I'm able to do these longer range things that are not about the bean counting of grants and so forth, yet I still pursue those things, but it's still like I can have a bigger impact now. And so while I don't know exactly what on a day-to-day basis, I spend a lot of time either on meetings or writing, usually manuscripts, or, thinking about, what are the next grants that I want to do that give me the resources, not grants just for the sake of having a grant, but a grant that's going to allow me to do something that I think is important, impactful, and that provides information or a model about something that I think we need to have more information on. And so that's essentially what I do on most days. And so tenure and just hitting a certain professional state and status does provide you that level of freedom to say things, do things, put you in places and spaces where you can speak with some authority and people listen. Some listen, some listen now, some listen later, because they will be talked to by somebody else who said, oh, you didn't hear him say, that thing or that, this other thing. So yeah, so that's kind of where I am, where I'm trying to go. But the last thing I'll just leave you with is, and we can pick this up with the second one, I chose a career in doing things that have been very contentious. And I've been told both directly and indirectly that my choice initially of studying Black men's health was career suicide, was, to say it nicely, a very poor choice, unwise. The idea of doing racism and studying racism as a public health issue was not something that was popular. It was definitely, why don't you just do normal stuff like eating, physical activity, cancer, blah, blah, blah. So we can pick up sort of, how do you make a career out of doing stuff that people tell you shouldn't, because you feel like you should?
I think that was a very good way to close out this wonderful interview. You should do what people tell you you shouldn't. And I'm sure a lot of people have received those messages over the years of, what not to do because of X, Y, and Z. But once you have developed that fire and interest, that I think plays a big role in overcoming, these naysayers, as maybe you could say, or even challenges that life throws at you on journeys, for different destination. Well, let's again say thank you for making the time to share your journey and continuing to mentor, us and so many other individuals that I'm sure you've had an impact on throughout your journey, but also congratulate you on your new position, where you said now you have the impact that you are ultimately wanting to have and will continue to extend beyond, the seeking of the grants and the manuscripts. So, Dr. Whembolua, any last words?
Once you know, I don't think I have nothing to add besides to say thank you once again for the impact that you have had, not only on populations, but also on other researchers. And here at the collective, we are seeking and we are aiming to mimic some of your work, which is to really have an impact on individuals and most of the population being a Black male. And if we can encourage some of them to join us in this fantastic opportunity to be like a professor or to be a researcher in a field that you actually enjoy, and making sure that we can answer some of those questions. And if individuals have questions regarding this presentation or these discussions, they can either reach Dr. Conserve on his website, myself, Dr. Whembolua, or Dr. Griffith directly. Once again, thank you.
Thank you.